Welcome to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. A Jewish mystical legend tells that during creation, something broke and shattered, scattering sparks of divine holiness around the world. It is our responsibility to do acts of tikkun olam, to repair the world around us. Each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those holy sparks, making our world a little more whole and holy. Today, I'm delighted to have with me an individual who is doing this sacred work of repairing our world, one spark at a time. Rabbi Abraham Cooper is the Associate Dean, Director of Global Social Action Agenda of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Rabbi Cooper recently received national attention for his interaction with entertainer Nick Cannon over anti-Semitic statements made on social media. For 4 decades, Rabbi Cooper has overseen the Wiesenthal Center's international social action agenda, ranging from worldwide anti-Semitism and extremist groups, Nazi crimes, to interfaith relations and the struggle to thwart the anti-Israel divestment campaign, as well as worldwide promotion of tolerance education. He is widely recognized as the pioneer and international authority on issues related to digital hate and the internet. Rabbi Cooper, welcome to One Spark at a Time.
Thanks very much for having me, Rabbi. Hi from Los Angeles.
We are delighted that you are getting up to join us for this program and to be here with us. You've been with the Wiesenthal Center now for several decades. Is this how you envisioned your rabbinate?
It's a really good question. I'm a product of the streets of New York. I had a chance to learn in Israel right after the Six-Day War and then go to Yeshiva University. And I was in track to become another Jewish lawyer. My father-in-law was a lawyer. My father, blessed memory, was a wonderful educator, mechanech, in the New York area, very rich Jewish background. And then I went to the Soviet Union for a month back in the bad old days with a buddy of mine. And that really changed the direction, of course, of my life. Landed up after my ordination and master's degree, taking my bride of 1 year to Vancouver, Canada, where I worked together with Rabbi Marvin Heyer, who was then the senior rabbi in that community. I had met him a couple of years before, working my way through school. And I have to tell you, I found him to be the first pulpit rabbi. Looked like he was having a good time. He had a great sense of humor, a visionary. He was respectful of his lay leadership, but he didn't seem to allow them to ever get in the way of what he thought was really important. And I guess in the back of my mind, I said, well, if I ever decide to go down that path, I'd like to be around a man like him. Okay. Long story short, 2 years in Vancouver. As soon as I got there, Rabbi Heyer said, oh, great that you came, because now my wife and I, Malki, can finally take a sabbatical for 6 months and go to Israel. So starting next Shabbat, you'll be delivering, the week, besides everything else of teaching in the schools and whatever. And that was a wonderful experience of actually having 6 months of, for the purpose of this conversation, called rabbinating. It was invigorating. I found out on the fly what the word invocation meant, having never heard it before. And I'm sure all of the rabbis listening and have, their own sort of war stories. But it was a very instructive period for me. Rabbi Heyer came back and had the idea of a Simon Wiesenthal Center and the school named in honor of the pre-PC Menachem Begin, and invited me to come with him to Los Angeles, which we did in 1977. So for me, though, my path, and even in terms of pursuing my smicha, was one of Jewish activism. I was born in 1950. My immediate family was lucky enough to have left Eastern Europe and Russia at the turn of the 19th and early 20th century. But nonetheless, the having teachers and being around people and kids who had no, grandparents, the Shoah had a much more immediate and raw impact on a lot of people, myself included. And then against the backdrop of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and Vietnam and all the rest. So I was very attracted to another young person named Glenn Richter, who started something called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. And their initial model Seder in front of the Soviet mission in New York City had 40 people with Shlomo Carlebach. And of course, decades later, it would be hundreds of thousands of Jews. So my path, in terms of my personal path, was one of being taught by my father and being taught in a wonderful Jewish day school and high school I went to, that the Jewish solidarity was extremely important, that especially after the Holocaust, we had to do more. So, having the smicha, experiencing the synagogue, which was so wonderful, we came to the conclusion that my path in a synagogue was going to be more about giving out Laffy Taffies as the candy man on Shabbat morning than going through the rigors of serving our unique people in a direct way. So nonetheless, being with Rabbi Heyer, who was a pulpit rabbi before, and seeing how he dealt with his fellow Jews and people he never met before, even though he was an Orthodox rabbi in a place like Vancouver, Canada, where back then it was pretty small, about 12, 13,000 Jews, later 20,000, but never massive. You really had to check your sort of theological credentials on the side. So if someone came up from the conservative movement and wanted help fundraising, he was a person for whom I saw the door was always open, and a person for whom the love of his fellow Jews was also paramount. And I think that helped, still has an impact today about, how I interact with people. So he certainly had a major impact, and I've always been a supporter of my local rabbi, and while I occasionally am asked to speak from the pulpit, my main job when I can get into a synagogue here in LA, and it's been a while, is to really be supportive of someone who had much more courageous than I to go into the rabbinate. I took the easy way out.
I don't think anyone would call this the easy way out. Every path has its challenges and requires its courage in different ways. And clearly, having those encounters and that relationship with Rabbi Heyer helped shape your path in getting to the Wiesenthal Center and the work you're doing with anti-Semitism, to understand what you've been doing with Soviet Jewry all the way through today. Looking back to those early years, when you first began at the center, what would you have identified as the primary threats at that time to the Jewish people?
Well, when we opened, Rabbi Heyer actually just returned from Vienna, where he asked the late, great Simon Wiesenthal personally for his Shem Tov, for his good name, invoking King Solomon's favorite quote, meaning, I know it's your most important possession, we want it. And what Mr. Wiesenthal said was, look, it's great to hear you're building a museum, because back then, besides the Yad Vashem, there basically weren't any to speak of in the English-speaking world. But I'm an activist, so I need to know, will you support me? I know you'll help me with Nazi war criminals, but I'm an activist in a broader sense, having experienced the horrors of the Shoah. Will you be an activist institution? And that was the connective tissue for me, because I grew up as an activist, music, kind of in a sense, music to my ears. And then having the opportunity to interact with someone like Simon Wiesenthal on a personal level. In the early years, obviously, Nazi war criminals, the early denial of the Shoah. And also back then, I think you're a bit too young, but coincidentally to everything else happening, NBC broadcast a series based on the book, The Holocaust. And suddenly, even before we had opened our first museum, we were deluged from around the country, from teachers, from the media, etc., saying, okay, this is playing, and so what are you going to suggest to the classroom, to the teachers? And then on top of that was the infamous Skokie March by American-born neo-Nazis through a heavily populated neighborhood by Holocaust survivors.
Sure.
That stuff all sort of converged, along with Germany about to pass a law that would have allowed all the Nazi murderers to return without the possibility of further prosecution, because there was a statute of limitations on murder that had to be overturned in the Bundestag. That thrust us onto the international stage. So I wouldn't say we had a sophisticated business model about where we were going, but what we also discovered, quite amazingly, Rabbi Heyer is an amazing visionary, and I think we were the first Jewish group to ever take a full-page ad out in Time magazine, asking for people to sign on, get postcards, sign on to a petition we were running. Eventually, it was 1 million that got to the German chancellor, a meeting with him, etc. But what we also discovered was a real secret that, if you will, Amcha, the grassroots of Jewish community, loved Simon Wiesenthal. He was the lone man who had virtually no support from organized Jewry, always, one bill away from having to close up his Vienna office again. And, we came in and changed that situation. But that's what really launched our institution from a local project in Los Angeles to what it is today, an international agency. And along the way, just to sort of, focus it back, it's all about leadership. I think for me, the exposure that I had throughout my career, but even before, when you spend 4 weeks in the Soviet Union and you meet Jews who back then had no chance to get out, none, and nonetheless said, do what you want, but, I got to get back to Israel. I'm part of the Jewish people. And these were people who didn't know an aleph from a bet. They had no Jewish knowledge to speak of. They couldn't get it. But boy, did they have powerful Jewish souls. In addition to that, it was especially difficult, and I think would have been difficult for anybody who's tuning in. I try to explain, I mentioned it to Nick Cannon, what it means for a Jew to be able to get off of a plane in virtually any city in the world and walk into a synagogue. In the Soviet system, the last place that you would go into, if you could avoid it, were the few synagogues they allowed to stay open, because they were controlled by the secret police. So right. You also had to do a lot of growing up in those scenarios. But again, for me, the inspiration of knowing that Jews around the world, whatever their station, whatever the level of knowledge, we do have something that binds us. It's kind of mysterious and usually wonderful, but not always. And that's, I think, something that's always guided me.
That's so powerful to hear that connection between the people, and knowing that you and Rabbi Heyer really leapt into the breach there, not having a full plan, not really having the intent, but when the opportunities came before you, you didn't hesitate. You had the courage to step up and to deal with those threats of what was happening in Germany, as well as what you saw with the Soviet Union. Today, it feels like we're facing multiple threats from a lot of different directions, whether it's the boycott, divest, sanction, BDS efforts against Israel, the anti-Semitism on the internet, which we'll get into it a little bit deeper with your interactions with Nick Cannon and others, as well as just the rise of anti-Semitic incidents across our country that's been documented, particularly these last few years. Let's start with those. What do you attribute that rise of anti-Semitic incidents in America over the last couple of years?
So, of course, we have difficulty remembering the pre-pandemic era, but it's important to remember that in the months before this all came about, Jews, including many religious Jews, were being beaten and shot at on the streets of New York and the greater New York area, and some people were in fact killed. I had a meeting with the top 3 NYPD officials during that whole period. And when I asked them, what changed in the last 5 years? And these were, veteran cops. They all said simultaneously, social media.
Wow.
Meaning that, whatever red lines, whatever systems we had tried to all put in place previously, and that would also mean, I think, those parents who were concerned, teachers and all the rest, young people discovered the internet early. They discovered social media, and of course, there's no filter. So the promotion of not only the hate and the anti-Semitism, but as you know, the way people express themselves often on social media, they would never do in a million years in real life. So I think that in many times would be the igniter, and you might call it the lone wolf terrorist, God forbid, like the murderers who shot up Pittsburgh and San Diego, what they did to the Muslims in down in New Zealand, etc. It's an extremely powerful, unprecedentedly powerful platform for marketing. And I think that's a key point. It's not a debating society. It's a marketing tool to push whatever agenda you have. You take that, you combine with the fact that the collective memory of the Second World War is essentially over. It has been probably for a while. The whole concept now of memory, which is so central to the Jewish people and the way we look at the world, our lens, the whole idea of history of memory is under assault today. In terms of what's going on, not only in the States, but especially about looking to erase the past. We've been brought up, as we say in our kishkas, deep down to know that the best way to move forward is always to connect to the past. And I think the other piece of this, in terms of combating anti-Semitism, is we are very much now a divided people, even on this issue of anti-Semitism. While the Wiesenthal Center will never go there, we like to follow what Natan Sharansky said at his retirement dinner. Very profound, but we don't do enough of it. He said, look, it's not the job of Jewish leaders to tell fellow Jews, oh, you should be a conservative or you should be a progressive. That's not our job at all. That's up to every individual. However, what we can ask of every Jew is that if there's an anti-Semitic incident that takes place and it emanates from your philosophical camp, you have a responsibility to speak out first. As a conservative or as a progressive. We've seen that occasionally, but not enough. And even in congressional hearings, you see the left and the right with plenty of Jews ready to line up to do the testifying. Instead of saying, hey, wait a second, this is a fundamental of American life, of protecting religious freedom, et cetera, everything in our world today, good, bad, and otherwise, have now become politicized. That weakens our ability. And then, of course, we all know the leaders who are watching and listening in, the Jewish community cannot defeat anti-Semitism. We need allies. We need our neighbors to understand us, to care, and to act, to help us out. So, and then again, we look at our kids and grandchildren. So the Shoah is a fleeting memory. Israel, until the pandemic, was, yeah, I'm going to go for 2 weeks with my parents, or I'm going to summer camp, or, I've been there 14 times and I'm 19 years old. The immediacy of Israel, of that experience, is great. But we now have the majority of the Jewish people born since it was established.
Right.
So, and there's a lot of debates there. So the things that bind us, there's no single, so overwhelming issue that brings Jews together, and that further sets the stage for anti-Semitism.
Sure.
Or I might say for anti-Semites.
Yes, absolutely. You touch on something very important, which is that the internet itself is becoming an echo chamber, especially on social media, where people say something and they hear their voice echoed over and over again. As we look at that only feeds that sense of division that you're talking about, and politicization of Judaism and the Jewish people. It's ironic that we're speaking a week after Tisha B'Av, where the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa comes to mind for splitting people over senseless reasons and hurting Am Yisrael, because we need to be together. You talk about social media. For some, they think about that only in the terms of Facebook and Twitter, but truly there are darker sections of the web where the white supremacists and others are notorious for using resources like 4chan to spread hate and terror. A few years ago, they did it in Whitefish, Montana, and they do it in other places. Is there anything that we can do to address those pieces that are even outside of our eyesight, but are certainly helping to feed the energy of what's happening underneath the surface?
Right. Well, you've raised actually two important points. My first reaction is, as far as the dark web, maybe that should be left overall to law enforcement and to experts who are swimming in that muck all the time. What we can say for sure, to validate your last point, is that what goes on in the dark web, if you want to look at it kind of like an iceberg, the stuff that we can see is bad enough. What goes on underneath is command and control. The language used about Jews, about blacks and others is completely over the top. It's dehumanizing, it's demonizing. That is, without a doubt, a part of the challenge. However, I think the greater challenge still remains not what's hidden, but increasingly what's being promoted right in your face. And in fact, a few hours after this is over, I have a conversation with the senior representative at Facebook. My first meeting there with them was when they had one building. Now I think they own 4 zip codes. But nonetheless, we very much push for the big boys and gals on social media to establish those red lines, to put people in place to deal with it, and to try to erode the presence, never eliminate them, of the bigots, the racists, the anti-Semites, and the rest. It's a huge challenge. I think, for many democracies that don't have First Amendment, they don't understand what's going on in the United States. And I think we also need to remember that these are all private companies using us as ATM machines, and we, just hand over all of our personal information. That does mean when you see something that crosses the line, you should communicate with them, and you should communicate with us. Send us the link, and we'll go there. The possibility of having to have regulation is something that should not be off the table. The only reason why everyone hesitates is that when it comes to government, they don't seem to do a very good job about anything. So awareness, activism, and the fact that as a consumer you do have some power. And then the other point, especially if we're talking about rabbinic leadership and other Jewish leadership and maybe some young people, we don't have a choice. We actually have to educate and draft our kids because they're on the front lines of this, whether we like it or not. You may be shocked by what you see. Trust me, your kids and grandchildren never are. They see it all the time. So this becomes also an opportunity to empower a teenager and say, look, we want you to put on, giving you a special prescription. We want you to also to make sure when you're looking on social media, here are your Jewish glasses. And if you say, oh, they're just trying to tease me, or, who cares what they say about Jews, that you can't build Jewish identity through anti-Semitism. That's a non-starter. But it's important for the family to talk about the issue and to, figure out their own strategies. What can we do? What, did we experience it? What's going on now on campuses? From Syracuse University to University of Southern California, every day, you have Jewish kids that are being bullied, sometimes by the university itself. They need to speak out. And if they can't, they need to reach out, whether it's the Hillel or the Chabad, or if they need to be in touch with us, we'll try to hook them up with someone like Rabbi Adam Miller. Silence, as we know, is a disaster. And, I think also something that one of the founders back in the 60s of the Black Panthers taught a very important lesson. He said that what he learned from the Holocaust is that helplessness is a crime. And we live in a democracy. So if we stand on the sidelines and say only, oh, I'm a victim, oh me, oh my, look what they're doing to us, somebody needs to come along and right, intervene in our behalf, et cetera, et cetera. You know, those days are over. We need people to roll up their sleeves. And we see a lot of energy from the younger generation. A lot of it is good and a lot of it is questionable. That's where leadership comes in the home and of course in the synagogue and temple.
Absolutely. We need that leadership. We need people to step up. You referenced there the fact that some of this has been around, particularly in pop culture. Perhaps it's because we're in this pandemic that people are just more heightened and aware of what's happening, particularly on social media. Let's transition into talking about your encounter with the entertainer Nick Cannon. For those not familiar, Nick posted on his social media feed some comments from Reverend Farrakhan, as well as some other anti-Semitic messaging, and you called him out. Tell us what you did and how that went from that point.
Right. Well, of course, we'll talk about Nick Cannon now in some detail, but I think the backdrop about Nick Cannon, about all these, this hatred that seems to be coming out of nowhere, it's all traceable to Farrakhan. He has been the most consistent, I would say, honest anti-Semite in the United States since the 1980s. Anybody who wants the compilation of his anti-Semitic quotes is Wiesenthal put on African Americans because the primary message they hear is about Black empowerment. The primary unmistakable message we hear is that of an anti-Semite. Judaism is a gut of religion, Hitler was a great man, et cetera, et cetera. So as you can imagine, with the exception of Shabbat, our great membership and our research staff, and now with the internet, people from all over the world are constantly sending in messages and updates. We have to do something about A, B, C, and D. And a couple of weeks ago, one of our researchers said, you have to watch this YouTube. So something called Nick's Classroom. It was from Howard University, the Harvard of African-American schools. And lo and behold, I might have been one of the few people who recognized not Nick Cannon, but his guest, guy whose name is Professor Griff. So when I had hair back in the late 1980s, I was the first person to call out anti-Semitic lyrics in a new music genre called rap. People who knew me, my colleagues, said, what are you talking about? We can't even understand what the words are. Who ever heard of rap? But, you know, I've been taught someone says something, hold them responsible. So we took on a guy named Chuck D, a group of Farrakhanisms into this group. Long story short, he was fired. Later on, he was brought back in. I understand that there's even a reference to me later on, not so nice, in one of their rap songs. Since nobody else can really understand it, I never took that to heart. But he was on the program. And I'm watching and I'm saying to myself, oh my God, here's a guy from the 1980s. He's parroting the Farrakhanisms. And then this guy, Nick Cannon, who, as you can see from my age, I didn't know who he was, not then. He started saying, you know, talking about, oh, so we're the real Hebrews, and talking about Rothschild, and said, oh, this is just outrageous. I got a guy in the 80s parroting Farrakhanism, and now it's 2020, and here's a new young guy, and he's doing the same. So what I often do for the center these days, I wrote a very brief tweet that said, anybody who wants to get a PhD in hate, watch this program. Well, apparently, Nick Cannon saw it and sent a message to the Wiesenthal Center that he would, he felt badly and he would like to speak, be in touch with me. We sent a message back, fine, but first you have to read this report on Farrakhan, because I didn't want it to be, an empty conversation. And that night, we spoke for about 35 minutes. What came out from that conversation was a commitment to write clearly, not a long Megillah, as we say, something direct. He said, well, I want to apologize to you. I said, hey, it's not about me. It's about the entire Jewish people. You were denying my identity. And Rothschild, hey, if we owned the banks, how come, I missed the memo? So he did. He wrote an apology to the Jewish community. And then he also added that what he thought was fact, that he was reporting fact, turned out to be propaganda that harmed another community. So he made those 2 points. It turns out this man's pursuing, believe it or not, a PhD in theology. He even quoted Hillel in Hebrew from Pirkei Avot, from Ethics of the Fathers. He had a tremendous interest in the concepts of repentance. I explained to him that the idea of tshuva, the concept itself, the possibility of change, is one of the greatest gifts that Judaism, the Jewish people, have bestowed upon the entire world. But then I also wanted him to understand 2 things. And the best way to explain the limits of repentance when it involves lashon hara, wrong rumors, is you bring in the Chafetz Chaim, the rabbi who would probably have no following on social media because his mantra was never, ever, never repeat a rumor, even if you think it's true. And the story goes that one of his followers came to him distraught and said, Rebbe, I've been following and listening to your sermons every Shabbat for years now. I know the lashon hara, evil, is wrong, but this morning I heard about my neighbor and I knew it to be true. So I repeated it to a few people. And of course, as you forewarned, I just found out that the whole thing is not true. What can I do to repent? So he said, do you have a chicken in your courtyard? He said, yes. Well, go home, pluck the feathers of the chicken, and make a path from your house to the front door of the person you hurt. Don't tell me his name. I want to know. And then back to my study. I'll wait for you. 90 minutes later, he comes back. He says, I did everything you followed. Am I forgiven now? And he said, yes. Just one more thing that you need to do, collect the feathers. So I told Nick Cannon was that he actually is a person who is probably best suited or better suited to try to collect a lot of those feathers because he's got millions of followers on social media.
True.
That conversation led me to say, okay, I told him one other thing, which also comes true. Be prepared for a blowback, a massive one. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the great former basketball star and accomplished author, a day before had written an unbelievable op-ed calling out anti-Semitism in the African-American community.
And it was a truly powerful piece. Yeah.
Yes, and he's got broad shoulders. He knows all about the Nation of Islam, and nobody can push him around on the court or in life. And he's spoken many times here at our Museum of Tolerance. I said, look what they did to Kareem immediately. You're a Judas. How much money did the Zionists pay you? They've got you in the back pocket. He's an Uncle Tom, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, not only did Nick Cannon get the blowback, but our Instagram, we had to decouple the remark section because the level and volume of hate coming at us from both, by the way, the Farrakhan supporters and neo-Nazis, which is essentially the same message. But I said, okay, let's meet. We met the next day. And here I think is also very instructive for those of us who are a bit older. So, they asked, is it okay if we film, if we record the session? said, okay. I mean, I was basically there to try to size up person face to face. And I think they've gone ahead and sort of put that up as a broadcast. But it went deep. It was a chance to speak about Simon Wiesenthal. It was a chance to urge him and others to read The Sunflower, to actually get a little bit deeper than I ever thought we would, where, you know, the one-line zinger would maybe be picked up, you know, by some media, and people will say, great, the Wiesenthal Center is doing its job, and it was, to a person who, despite, and I'm not naive, obviously his future in many ways was on the line, but this was someone who clearly wanted to do more. And I think, as I tell, filling the rest of the details, I think all of us should be thinking about, what would you do? So what would you do with Nick Cannon for the next meeting? Because the next meeting was here at the closed offices of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the locked down Museum of Tolerance. He met with, I wanted my colleagues, especially Rabbi Heyer and Rick Trank, both Academy Award winning documentarians besides the other things they do, and Michelle Alkin, our Director of Communication. I wanted them to size up the man too. And two things that stick out from that visit. One was that he held an original report that was written, typed, and personally signed by Adolf Hitler in September 1919. Before, he was still in the army after they had lost, and it was an intelligence unit, and people were supposed to write up who would be the threats to Germany after World War I. And when they asked, what about the Jews? Someone said, Hitler's always talking about the Jews, let him do the report. It's a chilling document. You can get to it at wiesenthal.com or at the Museum of Tolerance, or an important thing for people. It's a permanent part of the museum now. And he basically said, if you want to deal with the Jews, pogroms won't do it. Emotional pogrom. You need a government policy, essentially, to get rid of them. That's what he wrote in 1919 when he was a nobody. And almost to the day, 20 years later, he launched the Second World War. We know the rest of what happened. The message that we were sending to Nick was quite clear. Words have power. You cannot forget it, and especially someone like him who was in. And the other part, which was we didn't talk about publicly, actually, I think maybe till now, was I wanted to make sure we took him into a Beit Midrash, a study hall synagogue, showed him the Holy Ark, took out a Torah scroll. Every rabbi who's listening to this has done this one way or the other over the years. Opened up the Torah scroll. We read right to left. It's on parchment, certain ink, the person who writes it, etc. And then we opened up a Talmud, and he knew that, yeah, it's an Aramaic, and it's the Iraqi Christians. The man has a lot of information. I don't know if his generation and younger have a lot of filters, by the way, which is maybe part of the overall problem. But I specifically wanted him to see a synagogue and to see a Torah scroll, because, you know, since the day of Martin Luther, and right now, one of the most insidious, horrific, three words, synagogue of Satan. And indeed, I have been called by my newfound critics a Satan, this, that, and the other thing. The denigration of Judaism with these, you know, quick one-liners. We hope that we'll be doing some projects together. You know, we've got Mariah Films that has a couple of Academy Awards under its belt. We've got this creative guy now, and we're talking about doing some projects together. But whether or not that pans out, he's going to hear this term again and again and again. And the real test will be, will he speak up and say to whoever is saying it, what the blank are you talking about? You ever in a synagogue? I was. You ever see a Torah scroll? I have. So I think that, you know, it was a very instructive interaction. I've since, Rabbi Heyer since sent him Soloveitchik, Slowly Man of Faith. We sent one of the volumes from Lord Sachs. I think one Friday I sent him 2 quotes from Rav Kook having to do about light and leadership. But the most amazing thing that happened on Tisha B'Av is I sent him a link to a clip from our documentary, Unlikely Heroes, saying, Nick, I think you'll appreciate it. And today is Tisha B'Av, and explained what it is, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote back to me, oh yeah, I know today is Tisha B'Av. I'm fasting and using this as a day of reflection about, anti-Semitism and hate. And then, he's since connected with Barry Weiss, formerly of the New York Times. So, we'll see. I've had other experiences in the past with Ice Cube that have had their ups and downs. So, but he did have one thing that he knew about that also kind of floored me. He knew what the Rambam said, what Maimonides said about repentance, that if somebody asks you to forgive them, they have to ask 3 times. And if you don't, after the 3rd time, it's on you. So here was a person who had some basic knowledge, who's a voracious reader. And we all know people like that, like kind of a sponge. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, one of the great limitations of the whole internet era and milieu is there's no online librarian, there's no filter, there's no guide. And in many ways, there is a tremendous lack of real leadership.
Sure. So that's been beautiful hearing that interaction with Nick Cannon, and you clearly chose a different path than pop culture seems to be pushing, that concept of cancel culture, that instead of trying to call for Nick to be punished in that way, you opened the door or were willing to engage in dialogue, to build a relationship, to try to connect with him in a way that, as you said, would make him someone who would not just say, oh, I was wrong, but would also be willing to talk to others or call it out when he sees it. You noted earlier, as part of that in some of the blowback that's out there, anti-Semitism today is not on any one end of the political spectrum. If anything, it's a circle where the far extremes of all ends tend to meet, and anti-Semitism seems to be their link. It feels like we are kind of trapped when you see it from both sides. It was powerful to hear your comment about Sharansky, that in each community we should be calling out those who we identify, who we share beliefs with, who might be espousing anti-Semitism. Do you feel enough of that is being done right now? And what can we do in particular as we see anti-Semitism keep popping up in different spaces, particularly within this summer where there's been a lot of focus on racial justice?
Yes.
We've had a few questions coming in about Black Lives Matter and other groups, the perception that those are inherently anti-Semitic. Where are you on where we should be today?
Right. I mean, that is the central issue about, how do we go forward? Mr. Wiesenthal, blessed memory, always used to say, where democracy is strong, it's good for Jews, and where it's weak, it's not good for Jews. Right now, here in the United States, we have a broken social and political terrain that was years in the making, and it seems to be continuing to just go off the rails. And, everything that the Wiesenthal Center Museum of Tolerance, etc., is based on is trying to create and expand the middle, where people of different views and attitudes can come together to work together for a common good. And by the way, that includes the 130,000 police that our museum has trained, over the last 20 years. So we're right in the thick of it. I think it's real simple, actually. We need to be prepared to sit down and talk to anyone who's ready to respect us. If they're not ready to respect me for who I am, and I am at the end of the day also a proud Zionist, I have no obligation to sit with them. Anyone who hands you a menu, this is what you can say and not say, or a bill, oh, you want entry as Linda Sarsour, who unfortunately, whose impact continues to grow. But it basically told Jewish progressive women, oh, you want entry into this, into the next chapter of the struggle for equality? you better check your Zionism at the door. And I would say, to the credit of many of the progressive Jewish women, they did take a proactive stance, courageous ones, and we're going to continue to need for that kind of expression. But it also means that when I met with, finally, 3 weeks after what happened here in LA, with our mayor, Mayor Garcetti, I asked him straight out, are you giving money to Black Lives Matter? And he said, no, nor would I give money to any organization that has anti-Semitism in it. And we'll hold him to that. So here's what I told Nick Cannon. I think it's a good guide. Certainly it's what guides me. Anyone who presents a program in which everything in life is seen through exclusively the lens of race, nothing good will come from it. On the other hand, anyone who uses them saying, oh, they're all Farrakhanites, or they're all Black Lives Matter, and therefore I'm not engaging with African Americans at all, that's just simply deflection and an excuse. Racism in America is real. We have the Museum of Tolerance. I speak. In fact, if you go to our website, I did my own hour Zoom with 5 veteran African-American law enforcement folks from around the country, including Chicago and Detroit, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And it was an amazing experience, teaching moment for me, because these were great American patriots who for decades put their lives on the line for their fellow citizens. Describing, of course, racism is a daily part of our lives in our workplace, among our colleagues. And yet at the end, when I asked them, well, would you let your kid become a cop? 4 out of 5 said absolutely yes. So the notion that we should allow any anti-Semite or anti-Semitic group to dictate the course of events or the level of involvement of our community, leadership and philanthropy, and saying, give us a check, and by the way, we don't even respect you, and we'll do everything we can because we think you're Israel's colonialist, racist, apartheid, blah, blah, blah type of thing. We have to reject that. But at the same time, and maybe this will happen the day after the crisis, we have to work very hard to get to know our neighbors. I've gotten a chance now over the last couple of years to get to know a number of amazing African-American pastors. And the load that they carry, whether it's Queens, New York, or the inner city in Chicago, it's incredible. Do they ever get any coverage? Never. Were they there before this latest series of problems? Yes. Are they there now? Yes. Are they going to be there the day after? Yes. And usually our first conversation is, well, what about Farrakhan? And I know exactly they're responding. Says, that's all anyone ever wants to talk about Farrakhan. I'm a person who's doing my share in my part of this battlefield. If you're interested in working with the community, we're right here. So I think the day after the crisis, we need to redouble those relationships with people who do respect you or are prepared to respect you. I totally reject the idea that we have to be in lockstep with any movement that that's insisting that we turn our back on the world's largest Jewish community and the lone democracy in the Middle East, the state of Israel, because that's only the beginning of the bill. Once they know that you're prepared to, you'll excuse me, take a knee, to that vision, that's the beginning of the end for us.
So it sounds like it's a middle ground here of advocating for racial equality while being mindful of who it is that you're advocating for and getting into those conversations to ensure that there is respect on both sides of the conversation.
But it also means not just it means action, not only putting out a press release or having one photo op for multi-faith or interfaith meetings. We all live in communities. There are poor people, there are homeless, there's mental health issues, they're hungry. There's no shortage of issues. The most important thing is to tear down the stereotypes about the other. And the time to do it is not during a time of crisis. And if you sit on the sidelines, don't worry. There are many other people and movements and groups out there. They'll define the Jewish people, Judaism, and the Jewish state based on their warped perceptions. And we're going to wake up one morning and find out that many of our neighbors actually believe it. We live in a democracy. We can go knock on any door. We need to do our homework and show that we're in the Jewish tradition, as Rabbi Heyer said very often. Look, the number one target of hate crimes in America based on race are blacks every year since the 90s, FBI statistics. And the number one target of religious-based hate crimes, us. So there should be a natural synergy and also, the biblical narrative that was taken up by African-American leaders. We need not to assume it. We have to sort of reconnect it and update it. And, for me, by the way, it's more about multi-faith and less about interfaith, because I know there are a lot of people interested in looking in which ways our liturgy is alike, etc. In the work that I do, that's not my thing. My thing is find people who are prepared to respect you. You respect them back, and then you have to roll up your sleeves and figure out how you can work together. I want to make one other comment, if I can, about synagogue. So I go to Japan very often. I don't know any Japanese in terms of the language, but I've been there often enough that they generally know me, and that if I'm coming, it's usually trouble. So we caught a particular major company about to republish the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Japan, like equivalent basically to the New York Times. They knew that if we came after them, we don't play by Japan rules of bowing. We play by Brooklyn, New York rules of taking a baseball bat to the advertisers. So we made peace, and part of the peace treaty, I wish this would work in America, was they had to bring in two of the rabbis for a 4-hour session with their top 75 executives. And the issue that I spoke about last was the protocols of Zion. I brought in, for covers from books in 7 or 8 languages, and I gave, and in simultaneous translation. I can tell you, it's a very effective presentation because no Japanese executive ever wants to have to sit again and listen 4 hours consecutively in translation from some American rabbi. And so we made the presentation, and in the end, never do this when you're invited to speak in Japan, by the way. It's taboo. You're not supposed to say at the end of a presentation, are there any questions? It's a different culture. You don't do that. So having been born in Flatbush, of course, at the end of all my presentations in Japan, I always ask, so are there any questions? Never. It's always quiet. You never know if your sermon bombed or was the greatest thing. They don't show their hand. It's very difficult. But this time, the executive vice president of the company stood up and he said, yes, Rabbi, we have a question. And the following is a quote. He said, we want to thank you for coming here today and explaining to us, quote, that Jews don't go to synagogue on the Sabbath in order to plot the economic downfall of Japan, unquote. And then he went on to summarize my, whatever it was, our spiel in 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I said, well, sir, you did a great job summarizing, but what's your question? And his question changed my job description, and I think should be a reminder to everyone. Tell us, Rabbi, what do Jews do in synagogue? So when we have that teaching moment, whether it's in, with a group of people who are listening to a sermon, or you're with an interfaith group, or you're an elected official, of course, if you work in the issue of anti-Semitism, you want to defend your people. So you're prepared with all of the expertise about why this is a lie, and that's not true, and Israel is not an apartheid state, and we're not this, the other thing. Here's the secret. By and large out there in the real world, it's not so much hate as it is curiosity, especially now in the 21st century. Like, why would a Jew from Toronto care about what's going on in Jerusalem? I always ask myself, why would anyone in India care what any Jew has to say about anything? But there is a profound, sometimes insidious, but usually not, curiosity. What are we all about? I think that's really the central thing that drives me now, because I did 140,000 miles through March 7th. I haven't been on a plane since. So I travel a lot. And I've got, trips to Sudan and other stuff lined up if and when they'll ever let me go back and, see my grandchildren where they live. But I think what this also means, this is a signal to me that every single rabbi is on the front lines. And if they don't feel that, they need to reevaluate. Not that you got to get on a plane, but that the key moment right now is we also could use social media. And we can also use those interpersonal relationships. What are we about? What are our priorities? Why is Israel important to you? If you get that soundbite opportunity, don't play it by the rules of our enemies. That's the main motivator for me right now, is what can I do that's going to make Farrakhan get a stomach ache and not get 20 more followers? It's not easy, but the truth is that every rabbi and every pulpit and every teacher is empowered. And, when I was growing up, you never saw anyone with a kippah, even in New York, like representing the Jewish community. Rabbi Heyer and myself, we came to LA. The only people who were shocked was the Jewish establishment. Those guys with yarmulkes, they're getting on television, and they didn't clear it with the CRC, and like, what's going on here? But now, in a world, especially since 9/11, where religion, good, bad, and otherwise, plays an important role, values play a pivotal role. We have both the opportunity and the obligation to. We're not looking for non-Jews to put on tefillin. But we need to make sure that we can explain to our kids why they should carry on a tradition, and explain to our neighbors what we are, who we are, and how find ways that we can do things in commonality. And maybe the other one point which you hear a lot, which just drives me through the stratosphere, is this notion of Jewish white privilege. Every time I hear it, I'm on the immediate attack. 6 million Jews weren't white enough for the Nazis. The notion, it's true about HUC, it's true about the conservative movement. Heck, Yeshiva University started something called the Albert Einstein School of Medicine. You know why? Because there was a quota for Jewish kids to get into medical schools around the United States of America. That didn't happen 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago. It essentially happened yesterday. So our community collectively and Jewish leaders individually fought their way in order to have an opportunity to reach a point to where we're at. We should not be sanctioned for that. Others should be learning from us. At the same time, it's very important because Jewish person has one option that a person of color doesn't. We can exit the Jewish community. We can turn our back on our Jewish identity. We can hide it if we think it's useful. We can change our name. African Americans can't. But the idea, it's an opportunity again to explain to people, we're not a race. We have Jews of all colors. And so we reject the idea of looking at life exclusively through the prism of black and white. That's an important thing to say. And I think if you can get into a discussion, an honest one, and a relationship, whether it's a black pastor or a young musician or someone in your kid's high school who's been having a conversation on social media with your teenager, I think the way to do it is to attack the problem head on. But our weapons, our knowledge is our knowledge. If we don't know who we are, and if our kids don't feel that sense of belonging, they can be casualties pretty quickly.
Well, I want to thank you, Rabbi Cooper, for a very powerful One Spark today, for reminding us, especially here at the end, about the value of having relationships within our community, strengthening our sense of Am Yisrael, but also being cognizant of the fact that it's our relationship with others that will allow us to teach them about who we are, and that every single person, not just the rabbis, but every one of us has the opportunity to engage positively with others, to call out things when we see them that are inappropriate, but also to build the positive relationships that will help us strengthen the community and hopefully avoid some of those misunderstandings and challenges that you've identified that really allow others to plant the seeds for anti-Semitism. When you don't know, it's a lot easier to have negative feelings towards someone or hate them than it is if you actually know them for who they are. So thank you for inspiring all of us to go out and connect, to value those relationships, and to be a part of our One Spark conversation. I want to thank all of those who are in our audience for watching or listening to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. If you missed any part of our experience today or want to watch other episodes, the full video will be available through the Temple Shalom of Naples YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to the One Spark at a Time podcast, available on your favorite podcast provider. It's our chance, friends, as always, to take the lessons that we have heard and to embrace that teaching. Be the change you want to see in the world. We can all create a better world, one relationship at a time, one spark at a time. Thank you.